Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule this evening. You're now attending the webinar entitled Producing Outrage, the Poetics of Enslavement, and I'm happy to be joined by our past fellow, Dr. Hollis Robbins. I want to also note that tonight we're being joined by Gina Molinaro, who is a reading specialist in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. Gina is a member of this year's Teacher Advisory Council, and tonight she'll serve as our TA for tonight's session. She'll be active in the chat, sharing her thoughts as well as resources, as well as asking any questions that you all may have. So again, thank you for joining us. Dr. Robbins, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's session and thank you for joining. Just a little bit of information about Dr. Robbins. Again, she's the Dean of the School of Arts and Humanities at Sonoma State University. Dean Robbins is a noted scholar of 19th century American and African American literature, film, and poetry. Her newest book, Forms of Contention, Influence in the African American Sonnet Tradition, explores the relationship of influence, double consciousness, canon formation, and poetic form. Dean Robbins has previously edited or co-edited 5 books, including The Penguin Portable 19th Century African American Women Writers, which is co-edited with Henry Louis Gates Jr. It was also named one of NPR's best books of 2017. I can go on and on, but Dr. Robbins, at this time, again, welcome. I'll defer to you at this time, and I believe you are unmuted. And again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, and thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be back at the National Humanities Center, even if it's just by voice and distance. We're all getting used to distance so much in this funny year. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about what is a complicated subject, but an old and important subject, which is the poetics of outrage or producing outrage. And I decided actually to change my title from the Poetics of Enslavement to the Poetics of Disempowerment, because most of the works I started working on more recently and that I wanted to talk about this evening were very much come out of the abolitionist movement, but lend themselves to the poetics of being in a situation where you are not in power and yet producing poetry of protest and outrage. So I'm sort of expanding the notion of enslavement larger, more broadly to include disempowerment. And the readings that I had suggested for this evening were a piece that I'd published in the Chronicle in 2015 on the literature of lynching, which includes some painful and important lynching poems, some links to poetry of outrage, and a work that I'm working on that I very much love your thoughts on about the sonnet about lynching or about protest of killing and outrage, and answering questions of when you're teaching poetry or you're teaching poetry either to create poetry or in terms of examining and engaging with literature, where do you situate the poetic voice? And this will be the key subject of the conversation tonight. So I'm starting, let me see if I can get the slides here. In looking at the poetics of disempowerment, 19th century abolitionist poetry voiced outrage to spur opposition to slavery and race violence. But most of these poems worked from the voice of the powerful observer. So how then could one write a poem from the position of the enslaved or the disempowered? Does literary authenticity complicate literary craft? We'll examine the process of creating an effective poem, of effective poetic speaker and poem. And let me back up to say, part of this conversation came out of questions from this summer and the murder of George Floyd, and the question of holding up the camera of their iPhone so that we had that picture, right? And the question of what does that mean to be watching a brutal event from the sidelines? And very much And this very much resonated with the question of that many poets who write about difficult subjects would face. Where is the voice? Where is the speaker? Where is the person who is looking at the outrage? And what is the responsibility of the person who is at the sidelines looking at a horrific event, wanting to document it, wanting to voice outrage to it? What responsibilities does that speaker have to be present and yet to be simply an observer? And how do you be both an observer and producing outrage? So let's start with, and I thought of this very much as a working session. So I'm hoping that you might have a piece of paper and a pencil in front of you, or if you're at a computer, might be writing some things down and taking notes as a way, and I've done this in the past, as a way of teaching how to write protest poetry for students, to guide the question of producing poetry that actually works. So the idea here is that you are both understanding poetry, protest poetry, you're understanding why it works, and you're also offering an opportunity to create it itself and to teach the creation here. So how does how does poetry protest? Well, some of the questions that you would ask when you're looking at a protest poem is, who is speaking? Think about that. To whom is the speaker speaking? What does the speaker want to change? What is the argument? And where is the speaker? And the next list of questions you might ask are, what about the formal elements of a poem? What does the form bring to a poem, right? Would you write a haiku of protest, for example? You might. Would you write a limerick to protest, for example? Probably not. But these are important questions when you're working with students about protest poetry. What does rhyme do? This is an important consideration, and we'll talk a little bit about that. What does meter do? Does meter create a kind of sing-song, Dr. Seuss aspect of things, or does meter drive the voice toward the outrage? What does the I, or the we, or the you do? Is it an accusatory you poem? Is it an anthemic we poem? Is it just you speaking yourself as an I? What does the ending do? Are you ending with a big finish? And what does punctuation do? Students, well, grown-ups too, or everybody loves putting exclamation points in poetry and texts and tweets. What is too much? What is not enough? How does punctuation work in a poem? I had given you a link to the How to Write a Protest Poem, and I gave this link because it's a pretty good lesson plan, and it's pretty good. I've used it in the past to sort of give people an idea of how to go about thinking about writing a protest poem, and there's some good links here. And they have a very different set of links, but and I want to just spend a second on them because it's pretty good. They suggest constructing a poem around a catalog or a list. Adopting a tone of defiance, adopting the voice of an object, adopting the voice of an enemy, speaking from the point of view of the dead, asking questions, and directing the poem to a you. So even though these are a different set of questions than the ones I'm asking or the ones I'm working with, I think it's a very helpful link, and you might find it useful in working with students with this list. And it seems sort of funny to be thinking about writing a protest poem absent something to protest, but it works really, really well in the classroom. So I wanted to start as an example of something that is not controversial. And I looked a little bit at the audience chat, and I think this question, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation about it, the question of controversy or difficulty in the classroom is so important and is increasingly important in the past few years. When in the essays that I wrote for the Chronicle on the literature of lynching, there's a couple of poems that have the N-word in them. And once upon a time, I would have felt comfortable teaching that, and now I don't. I think there is, I think it has gotten to it. Students are very uncomfortable, and rightly so. And it seems better these days not to teach those poems. Other people can have a different opinion and teach them. And you know, I saw in the chat a number of conversations about creating places of trust in the classroom. So I think this is a good. It is a matter of individual taste or sensibility, but I'm just saying that, and we're not going to be reading those poems today. And we're going to read something a little less controversial. So one of the examples that I think is helpful is to look at Lawrence Dunbar's Sympathy, which most people know as the source of the caged, or a source of the caged bird trope. So I'll just read a little bit of this. It opens, I'll start with the title, Sympathy. I know what the caged bird feels, alas, when the sun is bright on the upland slopes, when the wind stirs soft through the springing grass, and the river flows like a stream of glass, when the first bird sings and the first bud opes, and the faint perfume from its chalice steals, I know what the caged bird feels. I know why the caged bird beats his wing, till its blood is red on the cruel bars, for he must fly back to his perch and cling, when he fain would be on the bough a swing. And a pain still throbs in the old scars, and they pulse again with a keener sting. I know why he beats his wing. I know why the caged bird sings, ah me, when his wing is bruised and his bosom sore, when he beats his bars and he would be free. It is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that he sends from his heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven he flings. I know why the caged bird sings. So in teaching this poem, most students probably, understand the overt metaphor of the caged bird and what that means, and they sort of get the poem on a sort of surface level. And it may not work in 2021 the way it worked in 1899, when we have different sort of poetic ideas, and the diction used is a little bit different. But at the same time, you might notice that it's far more dramatic read aloud than it is just read on the page, and that the rhyme works in really interesting ways. Both like thinking of that last stanza, me, soar, free, glee, core, flings, sings. So, and I see that there are some questions, and I look forward to asking some, I guess that's from Gina, that these are, asking these questions, like, what does this do? Do you feel a sense of resolution when there's a rhyme? Do you feel a sense of tension when there's waiting for a rhyme? And after a while, getting into the technical aspects of the poem, students get very excited when they're looking at how the poem works or doesn't work or leaves somebody cold. And I want to move, we can come back to the poem. I want to move to a less well-known poem by Leslie Pinckney Hill, which also happens to be a sonnet, called To a Caged Canary in a Negro Restaurant from 1921. And it's interesting to teach this poem because it's a sonnet, and it's, I actually know lots about the history of the sonnet, but the sonnet itself, I think anybody who teaches poetry knows the history of the sonnet, and you would teach this poem as a sonnet, as within the tradition of the Petrarchan or the Shakespearean tradition, to say, why is Leslie Pinckney Hill writing this poem about a caged canary in the sonnet form? How is he looking at this this bird as a poet in the tradition of Shakespeare and Petrarch. And so I'll read this one. To a caged canary in a Negro restaurant. Thou little golden bird of happy song, a cage cannot restrain the rapturous joy which thou dost shed abroad. Thou dost employ thy bondage for high uses. Grievous wrong is thine, yet in the heart glows full and strong the tropic sun, though far beyond thy flight. And though thou flutterest here by day or night, above the clamor of a dusky throng, so let my will, albeit hedged about by creed and caste, feed on the light within. So let my song sing through the bars of doubt, with light and healing where despair has been. So let my people bide their time and place, a hindered but a sunny-hearted race. Now, it's a curious poem, and it's hard to say whether it's actually a protest poem, what is being protested here. And it's very helpful and very, very fruitful to teach this as a kind of protest poem alongside the Paul Dunbar poem. But I don't think it really works. And part of the reason I don't think it really works is the thou and thy, which are just a little, I guess, a little strange for anybody since 1950, I suppose. Students just will not get into it. They'll think, well, I can't write like that, and they're right. But it's an interesting poem to look for when teaching poems alongside some of the other ones. I found it always very helpful to teach a poem that doesn't work, because then the poems that do work seem to jump off the page a little bit. And I want to move then really quickly. I'm not going to read the whole poem to the more recent version of this, Maya Angelou's The Caged Bird, which is a longer poem, and I have a link to it in one of the links that I sent, which were a link of protest poetry. And you have the whole poem there. And you can see that she is gesturing to the Dunbar poem. So I'll just read a little bit of this. The Caged Bird. A free bird leaps on the back of the wind and floats downstream till its current ends and dips his wing in the orange sun rays and dares to climb the sky. But a bird that stalks down his narrow cage can seldom see through his bars of rage. His wings are clipped and his feet are tied, so he opens his throat to sing. And then the last stanza. The caged bird sings with a fearful trill of things unknown but longed for still, and his tune is heard on the distant hill, for the caged bird sings of freedom. And there's something about that last line which doesn't rhyme, which sort of hits you over the head and hits and startles you. And this is part of the question of, how does rhyme work or not work? So if we went back to our questions, right? Let me get back to this question first, right? In the who is speaking, when I'd go, if we were looking at the Paul Dunbar poem, okay, who is speaking? To whom is the speaker speaking? What does the speaker want to change? What is the argument? Where is the speaker? One of the things that we'd see that doesn't really work with these poems, I mean, they work, they're great poetry, they're interesting poems, but the who is speaking, right? It's hard to know who the person is who's speaking. To whom are they speaking? It's hard to know here. What is being protested? The cage? What's the other question here? What is the argument, and where is the speaker, are questions that aren't easy to open, aren't easy to answer. And these, you can see that asking these questions alongside the poem help a student get into it a little bit more. I want to move actually, because I've got a couple of more poems to show, and then I'd like to really open it up to conversation and questions. Probably the best poem I've ever had ever written. It's a protest poem. It's Claude McKay's If We Must Die. And I'm just going to read this because it works so well in the classroom. If we must die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying, but fighting back. So here, the questions of who is speaking. There's a we here that's speaking. If we must die. To whom is the speaker speaking? Is to other people in the we. What does the speaker want to change? Wants to change from not being courageous to being courageous. What is the argument? The argument is the whole poem, that if we must die, let it not be like hogs. And where is the speaker? Right? The speaker is right there with them. And if these 5 questions are answered, you will see, or I've noticed in using these five key questions, that these are the poems that tend to work better, that tend to jump off the page, capture the imagination, spur somebody to action. These are the poems that one keeps returning to over and over again. These ones, what does form bring to a poem, are the sort of more complicated questions to ask in the classroom. In this case, Claude McKay's poem is a sonnet. What does rhyme do is creates closure and a feeling of driving home. What does the meter do? The iambic pentameter. You can practice reading the poem out loud and feel the kind of marching. What the we does is the we produces the feeling of absolute togetherness, of oneness. It's anthemic. What does the ending do? The ending drives you on to sort of jump up and say, yes, if we must die, let us do it this way. And what does punctuation do? Well, these are it's hard to read an exclamation point in a webinar. But one of the things that I love doing in the classroom is practicing saying the poem over and over, or practice everybody just saying the last couplet with different kinds of punctuation. Here's a poem, a sonnet that isn't much as, I would say, overtly a protest poem as If We Must Die, but it works in a kind of similar way. Just get this up a little bit. From the Dark Tower. We shall not always plant while others reap the golden increment of bursting fruit. Not always countenance, abject and mute, that lesser men shall hold their brothers cheap. Not everlastingly while others sleep, shall we beguile their limbs with mellow flute. Not always bend to some more subtle brute. We were not made eternally to weep. The night whose sable breast relieves the stark white stars is no less lovely being dark. And there are buds that cannot bloom at all in light, but crumple, piteous, and fall. So in the dark we hide the heart that bleeds, and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. It's a really terrific sonnet. And it, again, I think, like the Leslie Pinckney Hill poem, it is not overtly a protest poem. It produces outrage, but in a quieter way, not in an overt way. And I think, similarly to the Claude McKay, it works by who is speaking. Well, one of the we, and to whom are they speaking? To others of the we. And what is the argument? Well, that's a complicated question. The argument is we shall not always plant while others reap. There's a seed and a sort of planting and farming metaphor going on. And the argument is, from the last couplet, in the dark we hide the heart that bleeds and wait and tend our agonizing seeds. It's producing outrage, but not sort of saying, okay, let's get up and protest this. Again, it's an interesting poem that works well with students for a whole bunch of reasons. And sort of, again, gets at the question of like, well, could this have been a different kind of poem? It is the poem that it is, and works in some ways, but the argument is a little more subtle. And I want to, let me see, there's a couple of other things. The last poem I want to read, which is a poem that produces outrage and sort of produces humor and outrage, and is one of my favorite sonnets to teach because it is so simple and so complicated at the same time, which is Terence Hayes's Sonnet. And I love having the students read this. Sonnet. We sliced the watermelon into smiles. 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 I have to stop because it's just such a fascinating poem that, well, I'll just say that the ways that the conversation can move after that is infinite, about why it's a sonnet, about how it's a sonnet, about whether you can think about meter or whether you can think about rhyme in a poem that repeats the same line 14 times, whether this is producing outrage, whether it's producing humor, whether it's protesting something, whether it's just simply commenting on something. So I wanted to add it to the conversation just because it is so extraordinary. So to go back to this, I suppose, question, again, the way I move forward is to say, as the assignment, let's write a protest poem. And I thought maybe I could organize this with those of you here to say, let's just write a protest poem. So think about something, and I'll do this alongside you. Imagine for a second, just you're writing a protest poem. Who is speaking? Pick a speaker. And when I say pick a speaker, it doesn't have to be you. Perhaps you have a family member who you don't like. Perhaps you have a neighbor that you do like. Perhaps you have a child. Just pick somebody who you think, in fact, maybe it's easier not to do you. Maybe it's easier to pick somebody you don't like, you don't know well. Sometimes that distance allows you to write a different kind of poem. So pick somebody. I'm going to actually pick somebody. I'm going to pick my brother David. I'm going to have to tell him this. All right, so to whom is the speaker speaking? So this is a very helpful part of this exercise. Pick somebody that your speaker would be speaking to. And then think, okay, what is this protest poem about? What does the speaker want to change? And this could be about anything. I mean, you can make it about a big thing. You can make it about a little thing. There's a stoplight at the end of your street that you would prefer to be a stop sign. Maybe there's a stop sign at the end of your street that you would prefer to be a stop light, right? Having something material that you would want to change, it sometimes makes for a more interesting poem. And then ask yourself, where is the speaker? Is the speaker sitting, let's just say it's my brother Dave, looking at the end of the street and wanting it to be going from a stop sign to a stop light? Where is the speaker? Is the speaker standing right there at the end of the street? Maybe the speaker is in the hospital after there's a car accident, right? Think about where the speaker is when the poem is being written. And then what is the tone? Is the tone outraged? Is the tone melancholy? Is the tone urgent, pressing? And then think about this. Will take a little bit more time, and we don't have to talk about this right now, but will there be form? Will this be a limerick? Will this be a haiku? Will there be meter? Will there be rhyme? Will there be I or we or you? I guess in this poem, if it's my brother Dave, it will be an I poem. But he might write it in the kind of we, like we who live on this street are really outraged. Is it a you poem? Maybe it could be you, department of the city, traffic, you need to do some change here. And then comes the hard part. How does it want to begin? And how do you want to end? All right. I'm going to actually stop there. And even though this is, and have some time to have engagement with you, because creating poetry, teaching poetry is so very much interactive. I'd love to sort of see, oh, I see there's a ton of questions. So I'm trying to figure out how I can move this to the top of the page. How do I move this to the top of the page?
And actually, I'll read them out for you. Thank you for, that exercise. And I hope the teachers who are here are getting their notes down. We would love to see your thoughts and ideas in the chat. But the first question that we have actually is from Jose. He says, today there is a concern around writing poetry that is culturally appropriative, or is a kind of quote unquote disaster pornography, with reference to Susan Briante, where the poet or speaker is writing from a privileged perspective. So he was curious as to whether this was an issue in the 19th century, where you were concerned about cultural appropriation and actually speaking to specific topics from a privileged perspective. Did you find this throughout the 19th century? Was this a concern or a matter of discussion then?
That's a great question. It's a great question for now. And it wasn't, it was a little bit of a question, less for poetry. But if you, one of the concerns on the ongoing concerns of somebody like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, not a poem, but a novel. But one of the ongoing criticisms is then and now are, who are you to write about this topic? When you're a white lady from the North, and all that meant in writing a story of enslaved people in the South, when she didn't have any first-hand knowledge. And, the pro and the con side of that argument is it's a very successful book that got a lot of attention and produced a lot of outrage and perhaps was successful. On the other hand, she was in a privileged position. She was outside the system, which gave her the freedom to write about it. As a matter of poetry, it's a really, really good question, because I was just racking my brains to think about concerns about appropriation and privilege. One of the complicated aspects of turn of the century, late 19th century poetry was the prevalence of dialect poetry. Not just African-American dialect poetry, but there were a lot of poems written in Chinese dialect, Jewish dialect, German dialect, and there would be these elocution books of poems and short stories that were meant to be read out loud, appropriating the accents and voices of another. And nobody ever felt like, I mean, Paul Laurence Dunbar wrote a lot of poems in Yiddish dialect, which is hilarious. And nobody ever accused him of appropriation. And there were white poets that wrote in African-American dialect that we would be outraged about today, but at the time was not considered outrageous. It was just dialect poetry of all sorts was considered an art form. So it's a complicated thing in the classroom today, and I would say that it's new. Before it was, again, at some point in time considered not appropriating. It probably wasn't all respectful, but in some cases it was. So it's an interesting question. I hope I'm answering it a little bit. Do you want to read the next question, Mike?
Yes. And actually, I was muted as I was asking, so I apologize for that. Robert Shell Smith, he said, for later, what is the connection between protest poetry and protest song? Are there similarities of formal structure and voice, etc.? And also, is this something that has been studied, that connection between the protest poetry and protest song?
That's also a good question, and I'm not sure. One of the struggles, I would say, not a struggle, it comes up a lot in today's classrooms, is the question of, especially when you're teaching older poetic forms. And again, all of the poems that I've presented today are African-American poets, because that's what I study. This doesn't happen if you're, there's in the piece that I gave to read on sonnets on lynching, which includes a number of sonnets on electrocution of labor leaders, or the killings of white or Italian labor leaders. Protest poetry, protest lynching sonnets included everybody. But in teaching Black poetry from older eras in today's classroom, there's always an urgency, or there's often an urgency to connect poetry and hip hop, older poetry and hip hop, or older poetry and rap. Like, what is the connection? And there's a lot of work. On that subject. Somebody will take the poets of George Moses Horton, for example, and say that he is the precursor of rap. Somebody will take another poet like Claude McKay and say, he's the precursor of hip hop. I'm not sure. This isn't a field that I study. It's interesting, and it's something that students like. I think one of the issues of structure and song and voice has to do with iambic pentameter. So if you think about a great deal of choral music in the hymn tradition is iambic tetrameter, like Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, who saves a wretch like me, right? So you have tetrameter and trimeter. And so poems that are in that meter very much lend themselves to song. But in iambic pentameter, I've been told by singers, is harder to put to music. Da-da, 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 da-da. Da-da, 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 da-da is less, apparently less musical. So that there's some writing, Shauna Redmond from UCLA, I believe, in the musicology department, writes a little bit about this, about Paul Robeson and voice and protest songs, which are primarily in iambic tetrameter, not pentameter. And in looking at sort of the protest song movement generally, certainly Bob Dylan, who writes a great deal of them, has no sense of meter at all. His lines go on way past pentameter, 7, 8, 9 beats per line. And Pete Seeger, in some of his labor songs are almost all in tetrameter. So part of the relationship, it really has to do with the meter. And there's a lot of we, there's a lot of you, there's a lot of I. And I will say that just engaging with those questions of pronouns and looking at pronouns, students love talking about pronouns. The pronouns in the poem are really important to get a grasp of what works.
Very good, thank you. Follow-up question. How do you persuade the student that the sonnet form is part of the protest and not something that gets in the way of the outrage? Robert Shaw Smith asked that question as well. How do you persuade the student that the sonnet form is part of the protest and not something that necessarily gets in the way of the outrage?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? So I think the answer, and I think Claude McKay gives us the answer. And I think I saw in the chat that a number of you, somebody had said, I thought I saw it at the corner of my eye, that some of these poems you hadn't seen since high school. I don't know, I guess it's not possible to take a poll of how many people have taught this poem. Is there a way to ask? I guess it's hard to know.
Yeah. Aside from populating the audience chat, I don't know that we're able to. So I would ask the participants if they have to please weigh in the chat box.
Well, so this poem, so Claude McKay's "If We Must Die," is written in the red summer of 1919, the year, after World War I was the first major war in which African Americans served as soldiers as equals, not completely equals, but certainly had a taste of freedom, wearing the uniform of the United States of America, went off, fought in Europe, whatever one thinks of the war itself, but had a sense of themselves as fighting men and Americans, even doing this ugly deed. Come back to America, and then boom, faced some of the worst race riots and lynchings and horrors in American history and in their lives. To come back to America after this experience in the service. And those of you who've seen The Watchmen and saw the Tulsa and understood or learned for the first time about the Tulsa massacre in 1921, 23, this was in a continuation of what started in 1919. So Claude McKay, who is a Jamaican poet and very much brought up in Jamaica in the British, in the curriculum of a British schoolboy, basically read Milton, read Wordsworth, read Shakespeare, and was really, thank you, 1921, was really steeped in this British tradition. And so in all of his poems, he started out writing dialect. When he came to America in 1912, he just continued to write and began to write more and more and seeing what things were like write in the sonnet form. And this poem, If We Must Die, is situated. You can imagine, 1919 was like the summer of 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. Just outrage worldwide, and it kept happening over and over again. Mobs and lynchings and destruction by townspeople especially against Black soldiers returning, or Black soldiers returning refusing to go back to old ways. And so you can see in this poem, you ask what the sonnet form does. Well, the sonnet form situates this poem in a history. And there is, if anybody has ever taught Henry V, right? There's ways that this evokes Henry V into battle with a Shakespearean leader leading folks into battle, saying, "Let us be men." So when you think about, here is this Black man, this Black speaker, evoking Shakespeare for his own uses, for his own purposes. And when you read this poem, there's nothing that marks it as written by a Black man. And quite famously, there's a lot of apocryphal accounts of Winston Churchill reading this in Parliament. This poem was found written on the wall of Attica, right? So I'll read it again, and you can see, right? You can imagine, if you did not know who Claude McKay was, that this poem is any person protesting, any person fighting, battling, nobly going into battle anywhere, right? If we must die, let it not be like hogs hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Then even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous cowardly pack, pressed to the wall, dying but fighting back. It's such a great poem. And I think what the sonnet brings, again, that Shakespearean heritage, that this idea that even though this is 1919, it is men facing oppression, and it is male, it is very male, facing oppression and battling that is both universal and particular. And I think in teaching poetry, and especially teaching African-American poetry, the important aspect of every poem, but again, particularly here, is the particular struggle and the universal struggle, right? And so what the sonnet form brings is that sense of universality. A lot of I love Amanda Gorman's poetry recently, both at Biden's inaugural, and I've studied that a little bit more, and I just heard the one at the Super Bowl. And her poetry isn't formal in this way, and it certainly wasn't protesting, but it gestures to previous poems. And that act of gesturing is an act of respect and an act of saying, I am acknowledging, I am within a tradition, and that gives me power. And I see Rob Shaw-Smith asking if it echoes Rupert Brooke's The Soldier. Yes, absolutely. Claude McKay read the World War I sonnets, the World War I sonnets, Owen Wilson, Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon. So he knew this tradition. He knew this tradition well. And he read a lot of the labor protest movements, labor sonnets, some of which I included in the piece that I wrote on lynching sonnets. And when he chose to publish this poem, he did not publish it in one of the Black poetry journals. He published it in a Marxist journal, The Liberator, because he wanted this to be seen by everybody, even though everybody knew. So when this poem was first published, and everybody saw it because it's electric, it's extraordinary, it was taken up by Black pastors across the country. I mean, for the next month of Sundays, this was read in the pulpits, right? This was the most widely circulating poem in the era, certainly for the first 4 weeks and then continuing after. And in my most recent book on the African-American sonnet tradition, it's interesting because it is included in almost every Black poetry anthology. But it's hard to see it as influential, right? Nobody quotes it, and it stands alone. And I think its influence was more the influence of, oh, okay, I guess the sonnet works for this. So that was kind of a long answer to your question, but I hope a thorough one. Might I ask if I'd be interested in anybody's, well, I'll wait for questions, but I'm also interested in what somebody might have used for in writing their own protest poem or beginning one.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. We don't have any other questions right now. Again, if there are any others, please feel free to put them in the box, but I'd be interested to hear more about what the participants came up with. So feel free to put it in the audience chat.
I suppose while I'm waiting for that, and again, I'll be interested in questions of poetry. I didn't see anybody had asked if anybody had taught the County Cullen poem or any of the other poems. I mean, most of these sort of emerge in Harlem Renaissance poems, Harlem Renaissance classes, but less in sort of poetry classes. Now, Terrence Hayes just has another book out on sonnets. And I think teaching Claude McKay's poem helps get at Terrence Hayes's work, not just this sonnet, but some of his more recent sonnets.
And Dr. Robbins, also I had to scroll back up in my audience chat a little bit, but Roberto Hernandez mentioned this wasn't necessarily a question, but as to the Terrence, I believe he's referring to the Terrence Hayes sonnet, but he mentioned that this poem would have been perfect for the author to have used different punctuation, just like the following lines. What is this thing called love? Question mark. What? Question mark. Is this thing called love? Question mark. What is this thing called? Question mark. Love. So I saw that, and I wanted to scroll back into my audience chat and take a look at that and let you know about that. But I thought it was really interesting.
Well, again, this works so well in the classroom because of that. Everybody wants to pronounce it in a different way. That exercise, yes. What is this thing called? Love, right? And there's the smiles to that too, because there's a funny part of this poem. I mean, what's so wonderful about this poem is, you know, evoking racist tropes, evoking minstrelsy, evoking Gwendolyn Brooks's "We Real Cool" poem with that "we," the sliced, right? There's a kind of like, you know, we've got a knife in our hand, right? There's something that's so wonderful about the way that this poem works as a matter of repetition and just engagement with those tropes. But yes, reading out loud is just amazing, and nobody will ever forget this poem once they've just even seen it, but especially when they've read it. I did see a couple of more questions. One is what is happening now that is part of this tradition. Well, the sonnet form has become probably the most popular form in Black poetry, less so in, I would say, outside the Black poetry tradition. So I'm just going to situate myself in what I know well. So Kevin Young, for example, who's the poetry editor at The New Yorker, writes a number of sonnets. Natasha Trethewey, the previous poet laureate, writes a lot of sonnets, and she's amazing. I would say Wanda Coleman is continuing to write or has written sonnets. Rita Dove writes sonnets. I think Claudia Rankine does not write sonnets. Fred Moten does not write sonnets. So I think and Claudia Rankine is probably the poet that most people know. Her book Citizen is in the direction of certainly Black poetry. but she doesn't tend to write informal poetry. So I think there's a mix of where things are going in the tradition. But now that I would say there is such a strong tradition of African American sonnets, certainly formal poetry in this tradition is fairly common these days. This question of using companion pieces to strange fruit. So in the piece that I had published on the literature of lynching, and there is a couple of poems there, one by Paul Laurence Dunbar on the old oak tree, which is a poem about a lynching from the perspective of the tree. And that is a very powerful piece to use alongside strange fruit. And in the piece that I had sent on the history of lynching sonnets, that very first, I included a number of sonnets by the poet Robert Southey at the end of the 18th century, so 1797, is what I would consider the first lynching sonnet. And to pair that poem with its complicated diction, as I talk about in that piece, with strange fruit, helps sort of emphasizes the fact that this is an old story and an old problem and an old topic for poetry, which gets us, I guess, back to this question of protest, right? That strange fruit as a protest poem works in a really complicated way. Who is the speaker, right? What is the argument? How does it work? And it works in a kind of roundabout way. So that's the kind of way that I would pair that. Oh, I see that somebody's got a poem here. I love this. The Who is Speaking? Oh my God, the Capitol. To whom? The American people. Oh, I love that. Can I spend some time on this? Do you want to read it out loud or shall I?
No,
I love this.
Please
okay,
do.
I love
please
this.
Do. We are, we're at
Capitol.
Yeah.
Okay, I love this. The Capitol itself speaking. I love this. Peter Rosenstein. I love this. The Capitol itself speaking to the American people on the violence, the violent protesters, the protesters. Oh my God, on my stairs, in my halls, and sad. You have to write this. You have to write this, right? That's great. And so then the next question would be here, right? You know, or let me do this one, right? What form? Let me get this list here, right? Will there be a form? Well, there probably should be a form in that poem, right? Because if it's from the Capitol, which is a formal structure, maybe a sonnet, maybe just rhymed verse in somewhere, there should definitely be rhyme, right? There needs to be rhyme, or I would think. You could do whatever you want, but it would be, you know, what voice, what does the Capitol speak in? And will there be a meter? And I love the I. And how do you want to begin? Well, that's a great question. You know, do you begin that morning? Do you begin when it was built? And how do you want it to end is also a great question. Oh, I love this. I love this. I'm so excited. I need to see this poem. Okay. Do you know and can you speak to a Wreath for Emmett Till by Marilyn Nelson? It is a wreath of sonnets. Yes. So I in the piece that I had sent on the lynching sonnets, I include 3 of those sonnets by Marilyn Nelson. And she's really extraordinary. I talked to her on the phone several times while I was writing my book. And one of the poems, which if you do happen to have that piece in front of you, the one that I find the most extraordinary is called Like His Gouged Eye, which watched boots kicked his face. And it's just an extraordinary poem. We must bear witness to atrocity, but we are whole. We can speak what we see. it sort of hits when I was making this list of what to work and how things work in protest poetry. I had these sonnets exactly in mind. And she writes, she said, the rules bring protection. She said the constraints of the form, the need for meticulous focus on her craft, kept her at a safe distance from the brutal and heartbreaking subject matter. And I found that that was really an extraordinary remark from a poet, to say, I write in this, maybe that answers one of the earlier questions. She said, I write in the sonnet form because it protects me. So yes, it's a great group of sonnets. Everybody should know this. Everybody should know these. So let me see. I wasn't quite sure your reasoning for why the Hill poem was a failure as a poem, as opposed to the McKay poem. Well, I hope I didn't say failure, because I love Hill. So let me come to this poem again. I like this poem. This poem, W.E.B. Du Bois, I think, no, he didn't publish this poem. Actually, he declined to publish this poem. And maybe that's one of the reasons I said it wasn't as successful as some of his others. I came across it in a newspaper, and I came across it in an early anthology of African-American poetry, and then it disappeared. And so perhaps what I mean, I don't mean to say failure at all. It's a great sonnet. I like it a lot, but it perhaps did not capture the public imagination or the anthologers' imagination, and very much disappeared. And I apologize to say anything else than that. I think it's really an extraordinary poem. I think poems that have this sort of old-fashioned diction, the thou and the thy, are harder to have an emotional relationship to. I think in various times, anthologers of Black poetry did not really like the last two lines. So let my people bide their time and place, a hindered but a sunny-hearted race. What happened during the Black arts movement in the Black arts, and when Amiri Baraka put forth the ideas of what Black poetry should look like in the 1960s, he very much, almost single-handedly, threw out a lot of the poetry from the Harlem Renaissance. And this would have been one of the poems that, as you might imagine, would not appeal to that protest sentiment. Right? The idea, so many of these poems were thrown out. Amiri Baraka and others who wrote about the Black arts movement said, look, we can't have these old-fashioned poems that were designed for white people. We need Black poems written in Black forms for Black people. So that's why, again, when I say that this poem perhaps didn't work to pass through that lens, because those last two lines are melancholy. But again, I teach it. I think I included it in my book, and it's a poem that's very much worth being read. So thank you for making me return to it, and suggesting I'm reading in the chat that it's not bad. And he's a great poet, and he's not very well known because his poem was a little old-fashioned. I see another question here. Do you see the sonnet, as especially in its early years, as a way to subvert European tradition, hegemonic text structures for Black writers? Was there an original intention of remixing the form to discuss issues of colonization and racial violence? Yes, and yes. It's an excellent and complicated and rich question. When Natasha Trethewey was giving a talk at Duke, the inaugural John Hope Franklin lecture about one of her new books of poetry, and she was asked about all of the questions that she would get, like, why are you using the sonnet form? Why are you using this European form? And she used to quote the Audre Lorde line, "You can't use the master's tool to break down the master's house." And I asked her, actually, after this talk, I listed off a list of the poems, the poets, that some of which I've listed here: County Cullen, Claude McKay, Leslie Pinckney Hill, and others, including Gwendolyn Brooks. I didn't include a Gwendolyn Brooks poem here, but she was probably the best Black sonnet writer who ever lived. And Natasha Trethewey stopped and said, "You know, you're right. I learned the sonnet from Gwendolyn Brooks. So if I learned the sonnet from Gwendolyn Brooks, then it's no longer a European hegemonic tradition, right? It's no longer a white tradition. It is a Black tradition." And I think, you know, from Rita Dove, with Terrence Hayes, with Kevin Young, and many others, as far as I'm concerned, from what I read, it is more of a Black form than a non-Black form in poetry, primarily because of this, what I call, or what is called in the sonnet tradition, the turn. And I'm going to put this slide up because this slide shows the turn, right? Where the first 8 lines, the octave, says one thing, and the next 6 lines often says another thing, right? And maybe not so much in this poem, but in the sonnet form, there's always kind of 2 voices talking. There's a problem, there's a resolution. There's a crisis, there's a response. There's a problem, there's a resolution, or there isn't a resolution in some cases. And that 2 voices, that double voicedness, is, I think, something that lent the sonnet form so well to Black protest poetry. So that's an excellent question. And I think the colonization question is another one. There's a really rich Latin American and Cuban sonnet tradition that has to do with colonization in a different way. There's a Cuban poet, Nicholas Guillen, who was very good friends with Langston Hughes. And Langston Hughes only wrote 4 sonnets, or published 4 sonnets, and they were pretty good. I'm not going to call them failures. They're pretty good. I like them. But he also, Hughes translated many of Nicholas Guillen's sonnets. So that Spanish language European tradition, you know, you could see that the European tradition participates in Spanish language poetry differently than English language poetry, and doesn't have the Shakespearean, just doesn't have Shakespeare in it. Those are great questions. I'm looking to see if there are others.
Yeah, absolutely. We're at about 8:14, almost 8:15 now, and so yeah, we have another 15 minutes that we're going to go. So, but yeah, if there are any additional questions, please do. I'm looking at Debbie's response. I love that concept of double voicedness. Yeah, that stood out to me as well, Debbie.
We see the double voices, I would say, more in this poem, right? You know, well, not so much here, a little bit, but in many sonnets. And again, I don't know how many of you had gotten to take a look at some of the lynching sonnets. But one of the concerns that I have been grappling with, and to get back to this question of where the speaker is, what I like about Peter's sonnet here, protest poem for protesting the Capitol, right? I mean, the Capitol himself speaking, or itself speaking, is that the who that's speaking was itself the victim, right? Was the person, was the issue, was the entity that was assaulted, right? Even though we see and we hear the stories of AOC, of others being hurt, you know, the voice of the Capitol itself being assaulted as an assault victim is really such a powerful idea. And the assaulted is, if I say, an easy position is an easy position to get back to this question that I opened with, right? The poetics of disempowerment, right? How does one write a poem from the position of the disempowered, right? So that the capital, that's a kind of, when I say easy, it's because it couldn't, the capital itself could not have stepped in, right? You know, maybe some of these, you know, movies that have, you know, fences that can come down or spikes that can come up, but there is no sense, right, of the capital itself as having agency. But in some of the lynching sonnets that are in my literature of lynching article, or in the other essay that I gave, one of the problems is, where is the observer, right? The capital can observe, but it doesn't have pressure to intervene. But Claude McKay has a sonnet called The Lynching, which I included in the piece that that was emailed. And when he brought it to the editor, his editor who published it said, you know, it's a great poem, but it could have been better, right? And what could have been better was a little bit more outrage. But how does the person standing there witnessing a lynching, shouldn't the person try to intervene or say no or cut the person down, right? And this is why this question of the position of the speaker is so important, and perhaps it lends itself to questions of, what to students, what is the role of the camera person, of the person holding up the iPhone when something brutal is happening? Is that okay? And you read about a lot of PTSD on the part of people who have filmed outrageous things, a sense of guilt, because all they did is sit and film. But aren't we so very glad that somebody did stand and hold up the iPhone? That's not passive, but it often feels passive in a poem. So that's the kind of question that I was getting at in that piece on how do you write a poem about a lynching? Where do you put the I? Where do you put the speaker? And how can you be outraged and passive at the same time? And I'd love your thoughts on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm looking through the audience chat as well. And Gina, thanks for helping out with the question there. There was a question about the capital poem that you were referring to, and Gina clarified that that was one that we received on our end per the exercise. There was a question about that.
If I had the slides, I would put up one of the Emmett Till poems, but I'm not sure how I could do that at this point. Is that possible to do?
I don't know that we can do that right now. We can put the links, maybe a link to it in the audience chat. We can do that. And also to just a further explanation for the question, Gina, the question about the Capitol protest poem, it wasn't a poem in and of itself. It was following the requirements of the exercise that Dr. Robbins mentioned earlier. So it includes who, the capital, whom, the American people, what, violent protesters / protest, where, the Capitol, on my stairs in my halls, and the tone was sad. So that's the structure that was placed in there. I'm sorry, Dr. Robbins.
No, so it's all good. I think what I'll do then is I will read, because the Wreath for Emmett Till is such a great poem. I think I'll read that last sonnet since there was a question about it. Yes, Peter, we all want you to finish that poem, so we're going to do that. So I'm going to read, this is the 14th sonnet from, and there is a link to it, or it's in one of the handouts. the 14th sonnet of Marilyn Nelson's wreath of sonnets to Emmett Till, and this one is called Like His Gouged Eye. Like his gouged eye, which watched boots kick his face, we must bear witness to atrocity. But we are whole. We can speak what we see. People may disappear, leaving no trace, unless we stand before the populace, orators denouncing slavery to fear. For the lynchers feared the lynchee, what he might do, being of another race, a great unknown. They feared because they saw their own inner shadows, their vicious dreams, the farthest horizons of their own thought, their jungles immune to the rule of law. We can speak now or bear unforgettable shame. Rosemary for remembrance, Shakespeare wrote. I love that, but the question in the chat about the person holding the poem passive. It's a great question. Is it passive? I don't consider it passive. I don't consider it passive. It is an active, and that's what that last poem, the Emmett Till, the Marilyn Nelson sonnet was speaking to, right? Is that testimony is not passive. Witnessing is not passive. And the
Absolutely.
Emmett Till poems are fantastic to teach. So yes, they're easy. I mean, it's interesting. This gets back to this question, which I'm so glad that we spent some time on the Leslie Pinckney Hill poem, because Marilyn Nelson's poem, like sonnets, like Claude McKay's, are formal and have what I would call high diction or high tone diction. But they don't have the old-fashioned diction. They don't have the these and the thou and the dost and the ist, right? So that they're easier for students, even while they're very high-toned and formal. So that's a great question. And I think the question of passivity is an interesting one. Again, testifying, witnessing is not passive. But then, I had also heard in another classroom, given the Me Too movement and the sort of need to intervene, right? There's, the need to step in, right? The urgency of stepping in. So it may be that students are hearing multiple messages about, is witnessing enough? Is stepping in enough? Is stepping in required? It is so complicated being a young person today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that resonates on so many levels with our teachers who are here tonight, that, witnessing and being a part and experiencing that trauma is not a passive activity. I agree wholeheartedly with you. We have about 5 minutes remaining, and at this time, I believe we're gonna go ahead and close. But Dr. Robbins, thank you so much. This evening has been wonderful. I mean, we have truly enjoyed it, and I encourage everyone to continue to follow Dr. Robbins' work, and please delve into the resources. And as I mentioned earlier, the webcast, the recording will be available in the Humanities in Class digital library. And so you can go there, and there will also be a host of resources that will be available. Again, Dr. Robbins, thank you so much. We truly appreciate this.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this. The questions are so fantastic, and I really, really am looking forward to Peter's poem. I can't even imagine such a beautiful example of exactly this issue of speaking from something other than the I. People have a hard time getting out of themselves, but that's just a sublime example, and it will be a brilliant poem. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Indeed.